Bueno, el uso del email es una actividad imprescindible para muchos de nosotros, sobre todo cuando negociamos y cuando estamos en un entorno profesional. Muchos de nosotros no sabríamos qué hacer sin esta valiosa herramienta. Valiosa, pero también peligrosa, sobre todo cuando es utilizada sin las debidas precauciones en un proceso negociador. Para hablar de ello, tenemos hoy con nosotros a Noam Ebner, que es profesor asociado de la Escuela de Leyes de la Universidad de Creighton, donde dirige el programa de negociación y resolución de disputas. Además de abogado, consultor en negociación y mediador, Noam publica periódicamente ensayos y textos que tratan de clasificar y clarificar algunos aspectos esenciales del proceso de negociación, de la disciplina en general. Entre ellos, la dificultad para conducir procesos de negociación online. Así ha publicado el ensayo Negociar por email, que va a servir de base para esta conversación que vamos a mantener con Noam. So, good morning, Noam. It's a pleasure having you today at our class.
Good morning, Ignacio, and gracias very much. I'm sorry that my Spanish is barely good enough to understand what you just said, and only that because I know the person you're talking about.
All right. Okay, so you have compiled in your test a negotiation or negotiating via email several approaches to the challenges a negotiator must face when negotiating using the electronic mail, and providing some insightful advices to overcome those challenges. The first question may sound pretty obvious, but in your opinion, what is the main difference between face-to-face negotiation and negotiating by email? What are the main advantages and disadvantages in case we are negotiating primarily online?
Well, that's both a very wide question and a very good one. And when I started researching this field several years ago, so I started off with the same question of advantages and disadvantages. And then I recognized that was a kind of a dangerous question to ask, because what is an advantage for one side might be a disadvantage for another, and what is an advantage for one context might be a disadvantage for another. So having said that, I think that the obvious thing that we usually call a disadvantage is this loss of what we're enjoying even now, communicating through Skype, is this loss of personal contact, this loss of cues, of nonverbal communication, of the tone of voice and the facial expressions and the hand expressions and everything that we use, both in order to engage our counterpart and also in order to measure our counterpart in how he or she is using them. Now I'm going to say why that's not, as big an advantage or a disadvantage as some people may think. I mean, pretty obviously, we're not all experts on nonverbal communication. Uh-huh. So even when we do see nonverbal communication or we use it to express ourselves, we're not always doing a very good job of that. Mm-hmm. So when people write about the disadvantages of email communication, they usually mourn the loss of the nonverbal communication, even though we're not very, very good or professional necessarily at using it. So one could ask, so why are we relying on it so much? And the answer is simply because that's what we've got, and that's what we're used to. Let me give an example of that. Yeah. In a good example, one of my research areas is the area of trust. Mm-hmm. And we all say, so how do you know whether to trust someone? So there's a lot of trust that comes from the mind, but there's also a lot of trust that comes from the heart or the gut. And very often the question is, how do you know when someone you're engaging with is this person trustworthy? And we all think that based on the other person's talking, speaking, facial expressions, eyes up to the left or the right or whatever we've been taught, mm-hmm. that we'd be pretty good at gauging, is a person being truthful or not? Now, research has shown that we make good guesses about this 24% of the time. Uh-huh. In face-to-face communication. Mm-hmm. In other words, we are almost always wrong. But we're very reliant on that. So we're making a lot of mistakes by being reliant on cues that we've gotten used to. I think this is all a very valuable introduction because it allows us to take a lot of what we're familiar with as the obvious disadvantages and let's set them aside for a while. And let's assume that we can become at least as proficient in reading, so to speak, between the lines of an email, in reading the words and reading the nuances of an email, or in writing the words and the lines of an email, to overcome that loss of nonverbal communication. And who knows, perhaps be even better communicators due to our ability to do so and due to the fact that we need to do that very, very carefully and mindfully, which we're not doing in face-to-face communication very often.
Okay, interesting. So you say that email negotiation is a rough playing field.
Yeah.
Is that true that when we use the email, we tend to be more competitive and biased? If true, what should we do to fight this tendency?
Well, starting with the question, is this true that we become that way? I mean, Ignacio, think back to your own email experiences with people. Have you ever? Okay, I see by the look on your face that you know what I'm speaking about, and I'm sure that all of you students listening to this, you're thinking now about that one situation in which you wrote an email that you regretted, 10 minutes after you sent it or a day after you sent it because how did I lose it? How did I become that person? And email tends to do that to us. Research into online communications has shown that certainly people at a distance communicating via text-based communications tend to lose it in that way. And that's how all the early internet flame wars developed. In online forums and through emails, and people just lose it at each other. Distance does that to us. A sense of anonymity does that to us. Other things that perhaps have to do with text and body language as opposed to, we can't see when someone's saying something as a joke. So yes, we get into more of that kind of behavior. Now, focusing on negotiation as opposed to communication in general or dialogue in general, research has found that negotiating through email, people tend to fight more, to be more contentious, and kind of as a result, or funneling that into specific negotiation behavior, tend to be more competitive in terms of the process. And while this hasn't been proved perfectly, it's still starting to show itself out in the research that they tend to reach less integrative agreements or fewer integrative agreements, which might be less integrative than face-to-face agreements. And there's more tendency towards distributive behavior and shoving the other guy away from the pie and grabbing a larger slice. Again, the research isn't perfect on this, and I would also suggest that as people get better at communicating via email, as I think we have all done over the past decade, we'll do a better job of this. But, until that happens, or until we are fully developed in the sense, this is what the research is showing us, and my practice has certainly led me to believe that this is true.
All right. As you said, probably email negotiation has a great potential to increase the information exchange and therefore to find more integrative outcomes. What is your advice regarding to this subject?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that email negotiation offers us opportunities. There are opportunities that we don't always have in this quick-paced dynamic of conversation where people cut each other off in the middle, even with a good idea or for a good reason, let alone to slap the other person down. But information gets lost and cut off and is staccato. And in email negotiation, there's like this different type of flow of information. Use that to your advantage. Be very, very clear about what you want to say. And if the other party doesn't seem to have gotten it, or if the other party, responds to half of your email and doesn't respond to the other half, you have the opportunity to analyze that, think about it, decide what you want to do, and then do it, all at a much slower pace than you do in face-to-face communication. Just as in a very simple way, you can actually wait 5 minutes before you click send if this is an important negotiation. Many people say this, but not many people follow their own advice. But I do follow my own advice when I know that this in particular is a negotiation that is very important to me, or that raises emotional issues with me, or in which I'm concerned that maybe I didn't understand the other person or that other person didn't understand me. Wait 5 minutes before clicking send. Read it one more time and see if it's worth sending in this condition. Reread the email you're responding to, and then the email that you wrote, and see if they if they mesh in a good way, or if you're talking kind of. These are all very practical things that we can do, and usually don't.
Oh,
We might talk about some of that also, but because it's easy to say. It's like saying count to 10 before you speak, but
yeah.
who does that?
So it's a great chance. It's a great opportunity for going to the balcony that you're
Yes,
recommending.
exactly. It has a built-in balcony.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So for sure we are worried about matters as privacy. For example, when we write an email message, we are not sure who will read it finally. How can we control the impact of our messages while keeping the right level of privacy?
Well, here's the bad news. You
Yeah.
can't. I mean, very, very simply, once you've sent an email out there into the world, you are accepting vulnerability. So email negotiation includes that risk. And there's no way around that. I mean, you can sign confidentiality agreements, just as you can in any other situation. You can inquire about the person or institution you're negotiating with before you do it. But in the end, the moment you click send, you are sending something out into the world that might come back to bite you in some unknowing way. It might be that someone might pass your letter on, might even alter your letter and pass it on. It's once you send an email to someone, it's in their word processing system. They can change it and send it on.
Yeah.
You might be able to prove afterwards that you didn't say that, but the damage might already be done. The person might send it around in such a way that that it reaches people that you didn't want it to reach. It could reach people on that side or people on your own side that you didn't intend it to reach. That's just kind of that's just the playing field that you're on. It's, in the end, when we're sitting in a room with someone else, those same considerations pertain. But email is a riskier playing field, and we need to understand that, which makes trust building all the more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. In your text, you talk about the need to build rapport with your counterpart, even when email is the main channel. Specifically, you refer to the concept of e-empathy. Could you explain a little bit the meaning a bit more?
Well, e-empathy, it sounds like a techie term, kind of, but what I'm trying to convey with that is that even though we often say, well, email, it's kind of a distant, cold form of communication, just like everything else on the internet, so it's not even worth trying to form the warm interpersonal connection that we often teach students or trainees of negotiation to use and to employ and to engage with when they're engaging their counterparts. We skip over that when we're writing emails. Mm-hmm. For example, if we teach our students to listen, so we skip over that in email. We assume the other person's read, so that so we've read it, so we've listened. But how is the other person to know that we've listened to them? Everything we teach about active listening, about this kind of listening in which we're transmitting, yes, we've heard you, and we want to hear more. It doesn't come naturally in any way by email. So does that mean that we shouldn't do it? No. On the contrary, it means we need to do it mindfully. It means that in every email we need to reflect that we've heard what the other person has told us. It's sometimes very easy because we have the words right there. We're not even relying on our memories. We're saying, as you wrote us, I understand that you are very concerned about X and Y and Z, and you can even use the other person's words, or copy and paste some of the other's words and say, I've heard you. Is there anything I'm missing? Is there anything wrong in my understanding? Mm-hmm. Add on, a sentence of empathy. I understand why someone in your position would be concerned over those three things. And then you've achieved, that reaching out and touching that we say is impossible but by email. We have to e-listen and e-reflect and then e-reframe, and everything else that we teach negotiators to do, we need to figure out its e-substitute. And it's all, once you start doing it, it comes very naturally, but it has to come from an intentional step. There's no point in reflecting what the other person said because it's all in the email chain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wrong. You do have to reflect what the other person said. And you do have to let the other person know, I've heard you, I understand you, I'm with you, now here's what I have to say about this.
Mm-hmm. Good. So just a few questions more. This interconnected world we live, cultural differences mean a great challenge for negotiators. I guess that when we add technology to cultural issues, the obstacles multiply.
Well, there are so many levels to address that at. And let me start off with one simple one. Um, Obviously, a great many intercultural issues arise when you're negotiating with people who come from a different place than you do. That's like a broad cultural. And since the internet has opened the world, we often find ourselves negotiating via email with people who are geographically distant than us, and therefore the issue of cultural differences becomes salient, just as they're salient in face-to-face, but just we deal a lot more with people at a distance. We don't have the opportunity to overcome some of that the way we do with in face-to-face interactions or email interactions in which we can always meet the person, once during the course of a negotiation, or we might happen to know them from earlier because we've met each other because we're in the same geographical location. So we're often talking with people we've never met before. That's one layer of problems. Let me add on what I've discovered as a second layer of problems, and this is that, when we're negotiating interculturally in a face-to-face setting, we have reminders, we have markers that remind us that this is an intercultural setting. Even, Ignacio, just the fact that you and I are speaking and we have two different accents, that reminds us that we are now, even though we're engaged in this very close conversation, we're using a shared language, we know that we're located in two different countries, but we've forgotten about that because we're on Skype and having this conversation. But there are things that remind us, whether it's body language or skin color or the way our faces look or the language we use or accent, that remind us this is a somewhat intercultural setting. On email, we don't have those markers. And that's when we start to forget. And this is particularly challenging when two people are speaking. This is only in my experience I'm sharing. When two people are speaking a language, a third language that is not their mother tongue. Because if one person has it as their mother tongue and the other person has it not as their mother tongue, then they will constantly see reminders of that, and that will remind them in text. That will remind them that this is an intercultural setting. When it is nobody's mother's tongue, then it'll just seem like a normal conversation that doesn't have those reminders that this is intercultural. And that's where people start making, very, very, very basic mistakes, such as not verifying that we're understanding each other. That's the most simple one. Just, we say things and we're just totally talking about apples and oranges, to use the American metaphor. And being very intentional about it means that we will remember that even when we are doing it through email. It means that we, overcoming this, we will always ask questions, making sure that the other one understood. We'll always read over our emails to make sure that we're not using a cultural reference that is, it's basic in our setting or our language, but it is not basic or understood in the other person's language. Just as an example, Americans constantly use metaphors from sports. Okay, many countries constantly use metaphors from sports. But when you say, this happened at the 90th minute, so that's something that will be obvious to you in Spain. You know what the 90th minute means, and someone who is not as familiar with football who is only familiar with American football will not understand that the 90th minute means that it's at what the Americans would call the bottom of the ninth.
Yeah.
I found that sports metaphors go kind of when you're and we use many more sports metaphors than we realize, and similarly as we use many other types of metaphors. Read over everything you've written and look at individual terms and say, are these universal, or will this mean something fundamentally different to someone, or just not mean anything?
Okay, so very, very interesting. And finally, yes, a couple of questions more. We have passed from using the email from our desktop computers to our smartphones and using extensively the mobile technology.
Yeah.
Is there any new effect on how we negotiate online? And
Just
finally, what is the future of email negotiation? Can you anticipate us your view about it?
I can carefully anticipate it. If I knew what the future of email was, both I'd be a very rich man, and I might take a guess at. Let me tell a quick story just to explain how fast things are moving.
Sure.
The paper that you read that you inquired about and that we're starting to talk about now was published less than 3 years ago. After it came out, 2 years after it came out, the book went into a second edition, which is very fast in by any standards. No credit due to me. It was a book on negotiation, of which this was a chapter. When I started to revise this chapter for a second edition, I discovered that I needed to write a brand new chapter. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so within these 2 years, smartphone proliferation and tablets now doing the same thing has fundamentally changed the way we negotiate through email to such an extent that I couldn't just add on a paragraph or 3 new sources, etc. I wrote a brand new chapter. No one was more surprised than me
Mm-hmm.
that this was happened. And I will send you a link, and you feel free to pass the link on to your students for the new chapter, which is coming out in a few months, hot off the presses, which is it's an attempt that hasn't been made yet, so far as I know, to take everything that we know about email negotiation, which is somewhere between the year 1999 and 2006 was when most of the research was done, which was before this new situation occurred, which is that now you are walking around with your inbox in your pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And we have never been in this state before. I mean, when you negotiated through email, so you either pictured yourself, you were at a desk in your office, or at a desk at home, or, at a cafe with your laptop, but you were at work. You were in a. Nowadays, we don't do that. You will be email negotiating when you are driving.
Yeah.
You won't admit to it, but you will. You will be email negotiation while you are with your kids at the park. You will be email negotiating while you are pulling down a box of cornflakes off the shelf at a supermarket and trying to picture, are these cornflakes cheaper than this kind of cornflakes? And in the meantime, you've received an offer and you're going to make a counter offer. I'm not going to ask you if you've done this yet already. Instead, I will, ask the world of students out there, is anybody going to raise your hand and admit it? I'm going to admit it. Certainly I have. And this fundamentally changes everything. It changes the amount of attention we pay to things. It affects the state of mind that we're in when we start to intake information. It affects the state of mind. It affects the distractions that we have going on. It means that engaging in negotiation is far more embedded in a lot of other stuff that we're doing. So if we're happy to be playing with our kids, we might answer one answer, and if our kids are annoying us, not my kids, but someone else's kids are annoying them, that will play out in their email response. Now, this is just a quick way to say that everything has changed. I've tried to capture some of that in the new chapter, and you can pass that on, but I think we're only starting to figure out just how much has changed and what we're going to need to do about that. So go figure it out. But don't think that this is an innocent transition. And for all of those who say, I would never do that, let me remind you of how, 20 years ago now you bought your first cell phone and you said, well, I'll decide who to call and when to call, and I'm not going to become a slave of the telephone. And how did that work out for you? And all the rest of you who said, well, I would never negotiate via email.
Yeah.
6 or 7 years ago, I would always do face to face or at least pick up the phone. How is that working out for you? Then I will say the smartphone in your pocket is a wonderful tool for negotiation via email, but be very, very, very careful and mindful and intentional and think about it before you start doing those things. What is the future of email? Just one word. I'd like everybody to think back on their own email experiences and notice that email is changing. Okay, the platforms are changing. It's not only the physical platforms that we're holding in our hands, which mean that we are now opening emails on different physical lumps of metal. Even the platforms themselves are changing. Gmail and Yahoo have both undergone extraordinary revampings over the past year alone, let alone everything that's happened in the past 5 years. 3 months ago, Gmail changed its complete system. 2 months ago, Yahoo transitioned all of its users forcibly to a new platform. Hotmail, which was the most popular email platform in the world at one time, shut down several months ago. And so on and so forth. It's changing. And with it, the experience of exactly what an email is. Is an email threaded under other emails? How do we view them? What kind of screen do they show up on? All of this is changing. So what I'd suggest, since we don't have time to get into that deeply, just look at everybody go into your email and look at your screen and try and consider what has changed over the past few years, and then start asking yourself, what might some of those changes mean in terms of negotiation? I've given some ideas for this in the book chapter, but I know that there are probably many more that are still waiting to be figured out. So anyone who wants to help me with that, please do.
Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much, Noam, for your words and your practical advices. It has been a great, great pleasure.
A great pleasure, Ignacio. Thank you, and thank you all, who's ever out there. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.